Hey, this is Jasper. I wanted to talk to you about where fascism comes from because it's something that is really crazy right now. We're in 2018 just started, and people have a lot of myths about fascism, but I think there's one way to really look at it, and it's to look at the history and the prehistory, the pre-fascists. So who are the people that became fascists later? So I would like to begin at the bottom here. 1888, Edward Bellamy. He writes a book looking backwards, and it was like 2000, from the year 2000 back to 1888. And so what's happened in the last 112 years? And it was this amazing futurism of very statist authoritarian futurism, and everybody was in collectives, and everybody was a soldier worker for the state. I forgot there was like really pre-fascist stuff in there for sure, but it became the biggest bestseller ever, the most popular book published in America, or the second. It might have been behind Uncle Tom, I'm not sure. It also was internationally very successful, and it became this kind of bedtime story of kids that were growing up to fight for social justice, economic justice, whatever. So it was the romantic revolutionaries, the romantic anti-capitalists. So that starts spreading around just as the Great Depression hits, and so this is like even worse than the one we know, the 1930s. The 1890s were worse than that. It was huge, and it just kept going. There was a second huge depression not that long in the future, another 12 years, so things weren't going that great. And this was a very important decade for this weird, let's call it, I have a new word I like, is romantic anti-capitalism. So this was that is the depression that hits. The pump is already primed with Bellamy. Everybody's reading it. Everybody's imagining this future without a market. There's no free market. It's basically like 5-year plans. He's invented the totalitarian future, and everybody's falling in love. So people that there was a part feminist. I haven't read it in a long time, but there's a part of it was feminist. I think maybe women were equally part of the society or something. There was some feminist stuff in there. And so that jump-started the first feminist movements in America, or at least maybe the first around that era that they called it feminism. And they formed, so they were fighting the depression, we're in the middle of a huge depression, and women started forming collectives for cooking and for all of this, because that was part of this vision of the future of Bellamy. And he, it's very interesting in the introduction, he calls it National Socialism. So this is back on the eve of the 90s. He's calling it National Socialism. By that, he just means a nationalist. So it instead of having an international worker class, you have your nations, both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So both the working and middle class are bound together in the nation, right? So that was national. It was a sort of very nationalist socialism. Perhaps, Sweden might be what comes to mind, the country that's really managed to implement that. But anyway, so the 90s were really, really interesting. So you had this romantic anti-capitalism coming up. So that by that I mean like the anarchists and all of these romantic revolutionary types that had been reading the Russian novelists. They have this imaginary romantic relationship with Russia and with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy in particular. So they're dreaming of revolution. You have that spreading all around. They're anti-capitalist. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in liberal or capitalism. They want to go back, and they're idealizing the farm. They're idealizing pre-capitalist society. This is in America. This is the decade that the populist movement came up. So that's over here, and I just marked these. So it was in the South and the Midwest, I think, was a really strong part of the populism. It was agrarian populism. It was anti-Semitic. So this is like your first real widespread anti-Semitism in America. But they're considered to be on the left. They're kind of owned by the left, but who knows. You had the Bellamy Club. So not only was Edward Bellamy the writer of this, but you had the club spread all throughout the United States. So, I tried to get numbers on this at one point. It's kind of difficult. Nobody's really written enough about this subject. But, California was a very strong part of the, Los Angeles in particular was a leader of nationalism, the nationalist clubs. And this is the first time Americans were using this word nationalism, right? It's coming from this futurist science fiction book that all the boys are reading before they fall asleep. So that, in the South and Midwest that was going on. I think, this is they're forming cooperatives, co-ops. There's a lot of, the early history of romantic left is here. It's farmers' communism. And I also put the West in here because this was a period, I believe it was the very first period when women got suffrage in one territory, maybe Utah or something. But it was a process here in the West that would, gradually, the Mormon states and other states introduced women's suffrage. And that was, starting in the same point. This is related to this feminism coming out of Bellamy. So it's the Bellamy nationalism. He calls it National Socialism. That's what people called it in those days. Socialism of the right, basically. So Theosophy, so you had all this really weird-ass New Age stuff spreading throughout America, Europe too. But it all kind of come out of New York earlier in the century, but you still had this whole culture around seances and spiritualism, and it was this romantic anti-capitalism in the sense they were rejecting the Enlightenment. They were rejecting reason and trying to have some direct experience of godhood or something, of not godhood, but connection with the spirit realm, something like that. But so that was huge, and it was spreading all throughout America and in Germany as well, where it would form many of the basics of the Volkish religion, which was National Socialism basically, which became National Socialism. Theosophy, Theosophy. So that's Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky, yeah. She was the big guru. So this was the first women's religion. They had sects all over the world, but they had competing churches. They were the ones who she invented the Aryan master race. She meant it something different at the time. She said they were supposed to be Indian, right? So the hidden masters communicated with her. So it didn't mean white to her, but she didn't, had this Aryan race was coming from her. Some of those Theosophy communes got into the early eugenics, so Krishnamurti was supposed to be the Aryan race guy. They were breeding the Aryan race on the West Coast. That was a New York Times headline from around 1915, somewhere around there. Then this is part that you really don't hear enough about is, they're called the pragmatists, but Dewey, the guy who gave us the Dewey Decimal System, and William James, they imported this historicism. They imported a kind of way of making narratives about, history or whatever. But that was their version. So this pragmatism was their version of postmodernism. So, this was, throw away all the rules, everything is subjective, nothing's real. So it was kind of a neo-Kantian, I think. They called themselves Hegelian, but by this time it had nothing to do with Hegel anymore. But, people just kind of, reuse this. Lukács said they're anti-Hegelians. But Kantians, you can say they were idealists. So they were romantics, too. And they're very interesting, and so they're really they're giving this new age philosophical respectability, the power of the mind, the power of positive thinking, all of that classical American New Age stuff is infused, and that they're like the James brothers' father was a big theosophist, so it's coming up from there and from transcendentalism. And then, this should be part of that Bellamy nationalist stuff. So you start to have the pledge. So the Bellamy clubs, the youth groups that are attached to their, club organ, they got the Pledge of Allegiance put in. Let's see. So this, this is a very interesting period, which will, with the next depression in 13 years, and then 4 years later you have so you have a huge wave of radicalism, and then this clash around World War I. We'll talk about that in the next. So, thank you. I hope it's not too long-winded. See you next time. And I'll think of a name. So if you have a good name, it's a genealogy of fascism, but, a genealogy of social justice, really. Talk to you next time.